When your dog is the only family member who never judges you, never leaves you, and never breaks your heart, losing them feels impossible. Marissa Blake knew this fear well as she watched her golden retriever Jasper grow older each day. She first noticed the lump on his neck during their evening walk, but she told herself it was nothing serious. Dogs get fatty lumps all the time, especially as they age. When she took Jasper to the local vet clinic, she expected Dr. Whitman to simply remove some harmless tissue. But when the young veterinarian cut into that lump, what he found inside made him freeze completely. It wasn't fat or a tumor at all. Hidden inside Jasper's neck was something that connected him to a mystery their small town had tried to forget for 20 years. What was buried inside her beloved dog that could change? Everything Marissa thought she knew about her life. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun filtered through the gauze curtains of Marissa Blake's kitchen window, casting long shadows across the worn linoleum floor where Jasper lay sprawled in his favorite patch of warmth. At 46, Marissa had learned to find comfort in these quiet moments before the day demanded her attention. The coffee maker gurgled its familiar tune, and somewhere upstairs, her 17-year-old daughter Emma was likely hitting the snooze button for the third time. Cedar Falls, Montana, population 3,200 according to the faded sign at the town limits, wasn't the kind of place that appeared in travel magazines or drew visitors from far-off cities. It was the kind of town where everyone knew your business before you did, where the same families had lived for generations, and where the most exciting event of the year was the annual Harvest Festival. 3 years ago, when Marissa had packed her Honda Accord with everything that mattered and driven west for Minneapolis, Cedar Falls had seemed like exactly what she needed: a place to disappear, to heal, to start over. The starting over part had proven more challenging than she'd anticipated. Jasper lifted his golden head as she approached with her steaming mug, his tail offering a lazy wag that spoke of 7 years of shared mornings. He'd been her one constant through the divorce, through the move, through Emma's anger at being uprooted from her friends and familiar life. While Emma had eventually adapted to small-town life with the resilience of youth, Marissa still felt like an outsider looking in. Her freelance graphic design work provided just enough income to keep them afloat, but barely. Most of her clients were small businesses scattered across Montana and North Dakota, projects that paid modestly but allowed her to work from the cramped home office she'd carved out of what the previous owners had optimistically called a den. The reality was that she spent most days alone with Jasper, designing logos for feed stores and creating brochures for local real estate agents, while Emma navigated high school and the social complexities that came with being the new girlhood. Stayed. The divorce papers still sat in a manila folder in her desk drawer, not because she needed them anymore, but because they served as a reminder of how thoroughly she'd trusted the wrong person. David had been charming, successful, and ultimately unfaithful in ways that still made her stomach clench when she thought about it too long. The settlement had been fair, legally speaking, but it had left her emotionally bankrupt and determined never to be that vulnerable again. Jasper stretched and patted over to his food bowl, his movements still smooth and strong despite his advancing years. Marissa watched him with the careful attention of someone who'd learned to notice changes, to anticipate problems before they became crises. It was a skill that had served her well in her marriage, perhaps too well, she sometimes thought. She'd become expert at reading David's moods, anticipating his needs, adjusting her own life to accommodate his shifting priorities. The irony wasn't lost on her that she now applied those same skills to caring for her dog. "Good morning, handsome," she murmured, running her hand along Jasper's back as he ate. His coat was still thick and lustrous, golden honey in the morning light, though she'd noticed a few white hairs around his muzzle lately. At 7, he was entering middle age for a golden retriever, but he remained active and alert, still eager for their evening walks around the quiet neighborhoods of Cedar Falls. Emma appeared in the kitchen doorway, her dark hair pulled in two, a messy bun wearing the expression of someone who considered mourning to be a personal affront. At 17, she had inherited Marissa's stubborn streak and her father's ability to convey volumes with a single look. Morning, sunshine, Marissa said, earning an eye roll that somehow managed to be both affectionate and exasperated. Coffee? Emma asked the single word containing a complete request, explanation, and mild complaint about the early hour. Marissa poured a cup and added the precise amount of cream and sugar Emma preferred. Another small ritual that anchored their relationship. They'd had their struggles during the move. Emma's anger at leaving Minneapolis, her resentment at Marissa's decision to uproot their lives, her frustration with small-town limitations. But time had softened those sharp edges, and they'd found their rhythm in this new life. Dr. Peterson wants to see you about the college application timeline, Marissa said, settling into her chair across from Emma. She thinks you should start thinking about your essay topics. Emma wrapped her hands around her mug and inhaled the steam. I've been thinking about them. I just don't know what to write about yet. You have time. But she's right about getting started early. The conversation was comfortable, familiar territory they could navigate without conflict. College applications represented hope and possibility, a future Emma could build on her own terms. Marissa tried not to think about how quiet the house would be with Emma gone, how the silence would press against her like something physical. After Emma left for school, Marissa settled into her office with her laptop and Jasper at her feet. The current project was a website redesign for a boutique hotel in Billings, work that required her to make their modest accommodations sound like luxury retreats. She'd become skilled at this kind of creative interpretation, finding ways to present the best version of something without crossing the line into outright deception. The morning passed quietly, punctuated by Jasper's occasional shifts in size, as he followed the son's progress across the floor. Around noon, she took a break to let him out into the small fenced backyard, watching as he performed his methodical inspection of the perimeter. It was during these quiet moments that she sometimes wondered about her choices, about whether she'd been too quick to retreat from the world, whether her desire for safety had become another kind of prison. Cedar Falls had offered her anonymity, but it had also offered isolation. She knew her neighbors well enough to exchange pleasantries, but she hadn't formed the kind of deep friendships that sustain people through difficult times. She attended Emma's school events and shopped at the local grocery store, but she remained essentially alone except for Jasper's steady companionship. The veterinary clinic sat on the edge of town, a modest building that had been painted white sometime in the previous decade and showed no signs of recent updates. Dr. Luke Whitman had returned to Cedar Falls 6 months ago to take over the practice from Dr. Morrison, who'd finally retired after 40 years of treating everything from prize cattle to beloved house cats. Luke's return had been the subject of considerable local interest. The hometown boy who'd made good at veterinary school in Colorado, coming back to serve the community that had raised him. Marissa had met him briefly at the grocery store and found him pleasant enough, though she'd been careful to keep their interactions superficial. At 32, Luke had an easy smile and the kind of genuine warmth that suggested he'd chosen his profession out of love rather than ambition. He'd grown up in Cedar Falls, but had left for college and veterinary school, spending several years working in a large animal practice outside Denver before deciding to return home. The decision to return had surprised some people who wondered why someone with his education and opportunities would choose a small-town practice over the financial rewards of city life. But those who knew Luke understood that he'd always been drawn to community, to the idea of caring for animals whose owners he'd known since childhood, to the satisfaction of being an essential part of something larger than himself. That afternoon, as Marissa worked on color schemes and typography choices, she noticed Jasper seemed restless, got up and down several times, walked to the window, returned to his spot by her feet. When she reached down to pet him, she felt it a small, firm lump on the left side of his neck, just below his ear. Her first instinct was concern, followed immediately by the kind of practical reasoning that had gotten her through the worst. Parts of her divorce, dogs developed lumps as they aged. Most were benign fatty deposits that looked worse than they were. Jasper was eating normally, playing normally, showing no signs of discomfort. Still, the responsible thing to do was have it checked. She called the veterinary clinic and spoke to Mrs. Henderson, who'd worked there since Dr. Morrison's early days and possessed the kind of maternal efficiency that made pet owners feel simultaneously cared for, and mildly scolded for waiting too long to call. Dr. Whitman can see Jasper Thursday afternoon, Mrs. Henderson said. 2:30 work for you? Marissa confirmed the appointment and spent the next 2 days trying not to obsess over the lump, which seemed neither larger nor smaller, neither harder nor softer than when she'd first discovered it. Remained his usual cheerful self, greeting Emma with tail-wagging enthusiasm when she came home from school, accompanying Marissa on their evening walks with his customary interest in every scent and sound. Thursday afternoon arrived gray and overcast, with the kind of autumn chill that hinted at the winter to come. The veterinary clinic's waiting room smelled of disinfectant and animal anxiety, furnished with metal chairs that had seen better decades, and magazines from some time in the previous year. A tabby cat in a carrier meowed plaintively, while its owner murmured reassurances, and somewhere in the back a dog barked once and fell silent. Dr. Luke Whitman appeared in the doorway wearing scrubs and an expression of professional warmth. Marissa. Jasper, come on back. The examination room was small and spotlessly clean, dominated by a metal table and the kind of fluorescent lighting that made everyone look slightly unwell. Luke's manner was gentle as he lifted Jasper onto the table, his hands sure and practiced. As he began his examination, "So you found a lump?" he said, his fingers probing carefully along Jasper's neck. "How long ago did you notice it?" "Earlier this week. Tuesday, I think. It doesn't seem to bother him." "That's good. Most lumps in dogs this age are lipomas fatty tumors that are completely benign. Let me just—" His fingers located the lump, and his expression grew more focused. This one feels a bit different than what I usually see." Marissa felt her stomach tighten. Different? How? "Well, it's quite firm and the shape is a little irregular. It's probably nothing serious. But I'd recommend removing it and sending it for biopsy, just to be safe. We can do that as an outpatient procedure. He'd go home the same day." The cost would strain her budget, but Jasper's health wasn't negotiable. They scheduled the surgery for the following week, and Marissa left the clinic with a mixture of worry and determination to stay positive. After all, as Luke had said, most lumps were benign. She had no way of knowing that this particular lump would change everything she thought she knew about her life, her past, and the quiet town she'd chosen as her refuge. The morning of Jasper's surgery arrived with an unseasonable warmth that made the autumn air feel thick and restless. Marissa had barely slept, checking on Jasper throughout the night as if her vigilance could somehow ensure his safety. He seemed oblivious to her anxiety, greeting the morning with his usual tail-wagging enthusiasm despite being denied his breakfast. "It's just a simple procedure," she told herself as she loaded him into the car, repeating the words like a mantra. "People do this every day. Dogs recover from this every day." The veterinary clinic bustled with morning activity. Mrs. Henderson greeted them with her customary blend of efficiency and warmth, explaining the post-operative care instructions with the patience of someone who'd had this conversation thousands of times. Jasper would be under general anesthesia for approximately 30 minutes, while Dr. Whitman removed the lump and cleaned the incision site. Barring complications, they could pick him up by 3 o'clock. "He'll be groggy for the rest of the day," Mrs. Henderson explained, "but by tomorrow he should be back to his normal self. Just keep him quiet for a few days while the incision heals." Saying goodbye to Jasper felt harder than it should have. He looked at her with those trusting brown eyes, his tail still wagging despite the clinical surroundings. She kissed the top of his head and inhaled his familiar scent, that combination of dog warmth and the cedar shampoo she used during his monthly baths. "I'll see you this afternoon, buddy," she whispered. "Let's be good for Dr. Whitman." The hours stretched endlessly. Marissa tried to work but found herself staring at the computer screen without seeing the words. She cleaned the house, started laundry, reorganized her desk drawer, anything to keep her hands busy and her mind occupied. Emma texted from school asking about Jasper, and Marissa responded with reassurances she didn't entirely feel. At 1:30, her phone rang. "Mrs. Blake, this is Dr. Whitman. Jasper's surgery went well, and he's recovering nicely from the anesthesia." Relief flooded through her. "Thank you. So it was just a fatty tumor." There was a pause, long enough for her relief to begin curdling into something else. Actually, I'd like you to come in a little early if possible. Something I need to show you." The tone of his voice made her stomach drop. Is he okay? Is something wrong? Jasper's. Fine, Luke said quickly. It's going to be perfectly fine. But I found something unusual when I removed the lump, and I think you should see it before you take him home. The drive to the clinic passed in a blur of worst-case scenarios. Cancer that had already spread, some rare condition that would require expensive treatment they couldn't afford, internal damage that would affect Jasper's quality of life. By the time she parked outside the clinic, her hands were shaking. Mrs. Henderson's expression was carefully neutral as she led Marissa to the back of the clinic, past the examination rooms to a small office that smelled of coffee and antiseptic. Dr. Whitman stood behind a metal desk, still wearing his surgical scrubs, his usually warm expression replaced by something that looked like confusion mixed with concern. "Please sit down," he said, gesturing to a chair across from the desk. On the desk's surface lay a small metal tray containing what appeared to be a piece of tissue the lump he'd removed from Jasper's neck. Next to it sat something that made Marissa's breath catch in her throat. A small cylindrical object, metallic and deliberately shaped, even covered. In surgical solution, she could see it wasn't natural. It wasn't biological. Someone had put it there. "What is that?" she asked, though part of her already knew the answer wouldn't be simple. Luke picked up the object with a pair of forceps, turning it carefully in the light. "It's some kind of capsule metal, about the size of a pencil eraser. It was completely encased in scar tissue, which suggests it's been there for a very long time. Years, possibly." Marissa stared at the thing, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. "I don't understand. How did it get there?" "Someone put it there," Luke said gently. "This was surgically implanted, probably when Jasper was very young. The scar tissue formation suggests it happened years ago, maybe when he was a puppy." Room seemed to tilt slightly. "But I've had Jasper since he was 8 weeks old. I got him from a breeder in Minnesota. No one ever mentioned any kind of surgery or implant." Luke set down the forceps and looked at her directly. "Mrs. Blake, I think there might be something inside this capsule. The weight distribution suggests it's not solid metal, and there's what looks like a seam around the middle, as if it's designed to be opened." "Opened." The word came out as barely a whisper. "I didn't want to do anything without your permission. Oh, this isn't medical in nature. It's not an identification chip. Those are much smaller and completely different in design. So something else entirely." Marissa reached out and touched the edge of the tray, her finger stopping just short of the mysterious object. "What do you think it is?" "I don't know, but I think we should find out." They moved to the surgical suite, where Luke had better lighting and the proper tools to examine the capsule more closely. Under the bright surgical lamps, the object looked even more deliberately manufactured, its surface smooth and unmarked except for the faint seam Luke had noticed. "The metal looks like surgical steel," he said, adjusting his magnifying glass. "High quality, designed to be biocompatible. This isn't something someone cobbled together in their garage." Using a pair of fine surgical instruments, Luke began working at the seam. The capsule had been sealed, but not permanently. After several minutes of careful manipulation, he managed to separate the two halves. Inside was a small piece of paper, rolled tight and protected by what appeared to be plastic wrap. Luke extracted it carefully, unrolling it on the metal surface of the surgical table. It was a photograph. The image was old, probably taken in the 1990s based on the color, quality, and composition. It showed 2 young women standing in front of what looked like a rural house, their arms around each other's shoulders, laughing at something outside. The frame, one had dark hair and wore a denim jacket. The other was blonde, wearing a sundress that looked handmade. Written on the back in faded blue ink were 3 words. "Remember what happened?" Marissa picked up the photograph with trembling hands, studying the faces of the 2 women. They looked to be in their early 20s, and there was something familiar about their features, something that nagged at the edge of her memory. "Do you recognize them?" Luke asked. She shook her head slowly, but the feeling of familiarity persisted. "I'm not sure. Maybe this one." She pointed to the blonde woman. "There's something about her face." Luke was quiet for a moment, then said, "Mrs. Blake, how long have you lived in Cedar Falls?" 3 years. We moved here after my divorce. Have you ever heard of the Hartley case? The name sent a chill down her spine, though she couldn't immediately place why. No, I don't think so. What was it? Luke hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. It was before my time. I was away at college, but it was a big story in Cedar Falls about 20 years ago. Two young women went missing. Sarah Hartley and Rebecca Morrison. They were best friends, both from local families. One day they just disappeared. Marissa looked down at the photograph again, and this time the familiarity struck her like a physical blow. The blonde woman, there was something about her eyes, the shape of her face, that reminded her of someone. Someone she'd seen in old family photographs. Were they ever found? She asked, though she was beginning to suspect she already knew the answer. No, the investigation went on for months, but there were no leads, no evidence of foul play. Just vanished. Some people thought they'd run away together, maybe to escape small-town life. Others believed something more sinister had happened. The case eventually went cold. Marissa's hands were shaking now as she held the photograph. Why would someone put this inside my dog? I don't know. But Mrs. Blake, there's something else you should know about the Hartley case. She looked up at him, afraid to hear what came next. Rebecca Morrison, she was my uncle's daughter. Dr. Morrison, the veterinarian who used to run this clinic. He never got over her disappearance. It's part of the reason he stayed in Cedar Falls all these years, hoping someday he'd find out what happened to her. The pieces were beginning to form a picture that Marissa didn't want to see. You think this photograph is of Sarah Hartley and Rebecca Morrison? I think it's very possible. And if someone went to the trouble of surgically implanting it in your dog, they wanted to make sure it would be found eventually. Marissa stared at the image, her mind racing through implications she wasn't ready to face. Someone had known she would bring Jasper to this clinic. Someone had known that eventually the lump would be discovered and removed. Someone had planned for this moment years in advance. But why my dog? She asked. Why me? I don't have any connection to this case or these women. Luke was quiet for a long moment, studying her face with an expression she couldn't read. Finally, he said, Mrs. Blake, what was your maiden name? The question seemed to come from nowhere, but something in his tone made her answer without thinking. Morrison. My maiden name was Morrison. The silence that followed felt heavy with implications. Luke reached across the desk and picked up the photograph, turning it over to look at the back again. Mrs. Blake, he said slowly, I think you might have more of a connection to this case than you realize. The drive home felt surreal, as if she were moving through a world that had fundamentally shifted while she wasn't paying attention. Jasper dozed in the passenger seat, still groggy from the anesthesia, his neck wrapped in white bandaging that made him look vulnerable and somehow smaller than usual. The photograph sat in her purse like something radioactive, dangerous to touch but impossible to ignore. Morrison. Her maiden name was Morrison. The connection seemed too coincidental to be accidental, yet too strange to be planned. Rebecca Morrison had disappeared 20 years ago, when Marissa would have been 26 and living in Minneapolis, newly married to David and building what she'd thought would be a stable, predictable life. She'd never heard of Cedar Falls then, never imagined she'd end up in a small Montana town where her family name carried the weight of tragedy. Emma was waiting when they arrived home, her school bag dropped carelessly by the door, her face creased with worry that she was trying to hide behind teenage nonchalance. How is he? She asked, crouching beside Jasper as Marissa helped him out of the car. He's fine. Tired from the medication. Dr. Whitman said he'll be back to normal tomorrow. Emma stroked Jasper's head gently, avoiding the bandaged area. What was it? The lump? Marissa hesitated, watching her daughter's face. At 17, Emma was old enough to handle difficult truths, but some truths felt too large and unwieldy to share without more understanding. It wasn't what we expected. I need to do some research before I can explain it properly. It was a careful answer, neither lie nor complete truth, and Emma seemed to accept it with the wisdom of someone who'd learned that adults sometimes needed time to process information before sharing it. That evening, after Emma had retreated, To her room to tackle homework and video chat with friends, Marissa sat at her kitchen table with her laptop and the photograph. Jasper lay at her feet, his breathing deep and even, occasionally twitching in dreams that she hoped were pleasant. She started with a simple internet search. Rebecca Morrison, Sarah Hartley, Cedar Falls, missing. The results were limited but consistent. A handful of newspaper articles from the local paper, a few forum discussions on websites devoted to unsolved mysteries, and one longer piece from a regional magazine that had covered the case 5 years after the disappearances. The basic facts were as Luke had described them. Rebecca Morrison, 22, daughter of Dr. James Morrison. Sarah Hartley, 21, daughter of Frank and Martha Hartley, who'd owned a small ranch outside town, best friends since childhood. Both described as responsible young women with no history of risky behavior or troubled relationships. They disappeared on a Saturday in late September 2003. Rebecca had told her father she was spending the day with Sarah, helping with some project at the Hartley Ranch. Sarah had told her parents she and Rebecca were going shopping in Billings and might stay overnight. When neither young woman returned by Sunday evening and attempts to reach them by phone failed, both families began to worry. The investigation had revealed that neither story was true. Rebecca's car was found in the parking lot of a roadside restaurant halfway between Cedar Falls and Billings, but there was no evidence she'd ever been inside. No one had seen the two women together that day. The restaurant staff couldn't remember serving them, and the security cameras from that era had been too grainy to provide useful information. The search had extended across 3 counties. Volunteers combed through forests and ravines, checked abandoned buildings and remote campsites. The state police had brought in dogs and helicopters. For weeks, the disappearance had dominated local news and consumed the attention of everyone in Cedar Falls. But no trace of Rebecca Morrison or Sarah Hartley was ever found. Marissa studied the newspaper photographs of the 2 missing women, comparing them to the image she'd found in Jasper's neck. The newspaper photos were formal high school yearbook shots and family portraits, but the bone structure was unmistakable. These were the same 2 young women who'd been captured laughing together in the photograph from the capsule. She searched for more information about Dr. James Morrison, wondering if there might be some family connection she'd never known about. Her own father had died when she was 12, and her mother had always been vague about his family background, claiming they'd lost touch with his relatives years before Marissa was born. The obituary for Dr. Morrison, who died 2 years earlier, mentioned that he was survived by his nephew, Dr. Luke Whitman, and preceded in death by his daughter Rebecca. No mention of other family members, no indication of Morrison relatives. In Minnesota or anywhere else, but families were complicated things, full of secrets and severed connections. It was possible that some distant branch of the Morrison family tree had extended to Minneapolis, that her father had been related to Dr. Morrison in ways no one had bothered to document or remember. The alternative, that someone had deliberately chosen her, deliberately placed that photograph where she would eventually find it was too unsettling to contemplate seriously. She called her mother, Marissa. "Is everything okay? You never call this late?" It was only 8:30, but her mother had always been an early 2-bed person, organizing her life around routines that had calcified over the years since Marissa's father's death. "I'm fine, Mom. I just had a question about Dad's family." Morrison's. There was a pause, the kind of silence that suggested her mother was choosing her words carefully. "What kind of question?" "Was wondering if we had any relatives in Montana, specifically in a town called Cedar Falls." Another pause, longer this time. "Why are you asking?" Marissa had prepared for this question, knowing her mother would want context before sharing information. "I live in Cedar Falls now, Mom. You know that? And today I met someone who mentioned a Morrison family that used to live here. I was curious if there might be a connection." "Your father never talked much about his family," her mother said finally. "He said they'd had some kind of falling out before we met, and he didn't want to drag old problems into our marriage. But there were relatives in Montana. There might have been. He mentioned a brother once, someone who'd moved west and become a doctor. But that was years ago, and your father said they'd lost touch completely." A brother who'd become a doctor and moved west. The pieces were beginning to form a picture that made Marissa's stomach clench with anxiety. "Mom, do you remember the brother's name? James, I think?" "But Marissa, this was all so long ago, and your father made it clear he didn't want to reconnect with that part of his family. There were hard feelings about something, though he never told me the details." After she hung up, Marissa sat staring at the photograph for a long time. If her father and Dr. Morrison had been brothers, that would make Rebecca Morrison her cousin. A cousin she'd never known existed, who disappeared 20 years ago under mysterious circumstances. But that still didn't explain why someone would surgically implant Rebecca's photograph in her dog, or how they could have known she would end up in Cedar Falls, or why they would wait 7 years to ensure the capsule was discovered unless they hadn't been waiting 7 years. Unless they'd been waiting much longer than that. She called Luke Whitman's office, knowing it would roll to voicemail after hours, but needing to leave a message while her courage held. "Dr. Whitman, this is Marissa Blake. I've been doing some research about what we found today, and I think I need to know more about the Hartley case. I think my father might have been Dr. Morrison's brother, which would make Rebecca Morrison my cousin. I know this is strange, but could we meet tomorrow to talk about this? I feel like I'm missing something important." After she ended the call, she sat in the quiet kitchen with Jasper, breathing steadily at her feet, and the photograph face down on the table. Somewhere in the distance, a train whistle echoed across the valley, lonely and mournful in the autumn night. The safe, anonymous life she'd built in Cedar Falls was beginning to feel like an illusion, as if she'd been living in a house with hidden rooms she was just now discovering. And in those rooms were secrets that someone had been very determined she would eventually find. Asterisk. Luke called back first thing the next morning, its voice carrying the careful tone of someone who'd spent the night thinking about complicated questions. "I'd like to meet," he said, "but not at the clinic. This feels like something we should discuss privately. Are you familiar with the old Hartley Ranch?" Marissa wasn't, but Luke's directions were clear enough. 20 minutes outside town, past the grain elevator and the abandoned gas station, down a gravel road that wound through stands of cottonwood and scrub pine. The ranch house sat in a shallow valley, a modest structure that had seen better decades, its white paint faded to gray, and its front porch sagging under the weight of neglect. Luke's truck was already there when she arrived, parked beside a mailbox that bore the name Hartley in letters so weathered they were barely legible. He got out as she approached, wearing jeans and a flannel shirt instead of his usual veterinary scrubs, looking younger and somehow more vulnerable in civilian clothes. "I brought coffee," he said, holding up a thermos. "Thought we might need it." They walked around the house to a back porch that overlooked what had once been a working ranch. Pastures stretched toward the mountains, their fences broken in places, the land slowly returning to its wild state. It was beautiful in the way that abandoned places sometimes are touched with melancholy and the weight of interrupted dreams. "Frank and Martha Hartley moved to Florida about 10 years ago," Luke explained as they settled into a pair of weathered chairs. "Couldn't bear to stay here after Sarah disappeared, but couldn't bring themselves to sell either. The place has been empty ever since." Marissa accepted the coffee gratefully, wrapping her hands around the warm cup. "How did you get permission to be here?" "I've been keeping an eye on the property for them. Checking the pipes in winter, making sure vandals don't break the windows." Seemed like the right place to have this conversation. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching a hawk circle high above the pastures. Finally, Luke spoke. "Spent half the night going through my uncle's old files. He kept everything related to Rebecca's case, police reports, newspaper clippings, his own notes and theories. I found something you should see." He handed her a manila folder, thick with papers that had been handled so often the edges were soft and worn. The top document was a family tree, hand-drawn in Dr. Morrison's careful script. "Your father's name was Robert Morrison," Luke said, watching her face as she studied the diagram. "Dr. Morrison's younger brother. According to this, they had a falling out in 1978, something serious enough that they never spoke again." The family tree showed the connection clearly. Robert Morrison, born 1952, married to Helen Stevens in 1975. One child, Marissa Morrison. Blake, born 1977, and parallel to that branch, James Morrison, born 1948, married to Carol Hutchins in 1970. One child, Rebecca Morrison, born 1981. We were cousins, Marissa said softly, tracing the connecting lines with her finger. She was 4 years younger than me. There's more, Luke said gently. Keep reading. The next document was a letter dated 3 weeks after Rebecca's disappearance. The handwriting was shaky, emotional. Robert, I know we haven't spoken in years, and I know you said you never wanted to hear from me again after what happened with Dad's will. But my daughter is missing, and I'm desperate enough to reach out to family, even family that wants nothing to do with me. Rebecca disappeared 3 weeks ago. The police have no leads, no evidence, nothing to go on. I don't know if you've kept track of our lives here, but she was everything to me after Carol died. She was smart and kind and had her whole life ahead of her. I'm writing because I remember how good you were at solving puzzles when we were kids. You could always see patterns that the rest of us missed. If there's any chance you might consider helping, or if you know anyone who might be able to help, I'm begging you to call me. I'm sorry about how things ended between us. Sorry about a lot of things. But please, if you have any compassion left for your brother, help me find my daughter. James, the letter was followed by a photocopy of what appeared to be a returned envelope, stamped return to sender in red ink. He tried to contact your father, Luke said. But your father had moved, and the letter came back undelivered. Marissa set down the coffee cup, her hands trembling slightly. Dad never told me he had a brother. When I was growing up, he always said his family was all gone. That it was just the three of us. People have their reasons for cutting ties, Luke said carefully. Sometimes those reasons seem less important as time passes, but by then it's too late to repair the damage. She continued reading through the file. Police reports filled with dead ends and false leads. Witness statements that contradicted each other. A timeline that showed the two young women had essentially vanished into thin air on a Saturday afternoon in September. But it was the last document in the folder that made her breath catch. A handwritten note in Dr. Morrison's careful script, dated just 2 years ago. If something happens to me before Rebecca's case is solved, there are things Luke needs to know. The capsule is in the Morrison file in the office safe. The combination is Rebecca's birthday, August 15th, 81. Someone knows what happened to the girls, okay? And someday they'll want the truth to come out. When that day comes, the capsule will find its way to the right person. I've made sure of that, Marissa. Looked up at Luke, her mind struggling to process what she'd just read. The capsule. Your uncle knew about the capsule? Luke nodded grimly. I found this note yesterday evening after you called. I went to the office safe and there was a file labeled Morrison. Not Rebecca Morrison, just Morrison. It contained information about your father, about his address in Minneapolis, about your family. How could he have known about us? I think he'd been keeping track of your father's family for years, hoping someday to reconnect, or at least to know what happened to his brother's life when your father died. Dr. Morrison somehow learned about you and Emma, and when you moved to Cedar Falls 3 years ago, he knew. The implications were staggering. Are you saying your uncle put that photograph in Jasper? I think he arranged for it to be put there, yes? There's a note in the file about a veterinarian in Minneapolis, someone Dr. Morrison had corresponded with. I think he arranged for the capsule to be implanted when Jasper was a puppy, with instructions that if you ever brought Jasper to a veterinarian in Cedar Falls, they were to call him immediately. Marissa stood up abruptly, pacing to the edge of the porch. The vast landscape spread before her, beautiful and indifferent to human complications. This is insane. You're telling me that my dog has been carrying a message for 7 years? That? Your uncle orchestrated this whole thing, that somehow he knew I'd end up here. I'm telling you that my uncle was a man who never stopped looking for his daughter, Luke said quietly, and that he believed someday someone would want to tell the truth about what happened to her. She turned back to face him. But why me? Why not the police? Why not hire a private investigator? Maybe because you're family. Maybe because he thought you'd care enough to see it through. Or maybe because he believed that whoever was responsible for Rebecca's disappearance would eventually make contact with you. The thought sent a chill down her spine. Make contact with me? Why would they do that? Luke was quiet for a long moment, studying the documents in his lap. There's one more thing, he said finally. Something I haven't told you yet." He pulled out a smaller folder, one that had been tucked beneath the others. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a printout of an email. Dated just 3 months ago, the subject line read, "She's here." The message was brief. "James, the Morrison girl, is living in Cedar Falls now. Thought you should know. She brought her dog to young Whitman's clinic last week for routine shots. Looks just like her father." A friend, the email had been sent to Dr. Morrison's personal account 3 days before his fatal heart attack. Marissa sank back into her chair, her mind reeling. "Someone's been watching me. It looks that way," Luke said grimly. "And whoever it was wanted my uncle to know you were here." They sat in silence, processing the implications. Somewhere in the distance, a meadowlark called, its song bright and cheerful in contrast to the dark revelations spreading between them. "What do we do now?" Marissa asked. Finally, Luke closed the folders and looked out across the abandoned pastures. "I think we need to find out what really happened to Rebecca and Sarah. And I think we need to be very careful while we're doing it." The decision to investigate felt both inevitable and terrifying. That evening, Marissa sat at her kitchen table with a yellow legal pad, trying to organize what they knew into something that resembled a coherent timeline. Emma was at a friend's house working on a group project, which gave Marissa the privacy to spread out the documents Luke had shared and really study them. Jasper lay nearby, his neck bandage already looking smaller and less threatening. The surgical site was healing well, and his appetite had returned with typical golden retriever enthusiasm. It was strange to think that for 7 years he'd been carrying this secret in his body, a message from a desperate father to a niece who'd never known she existed. The photograph sat propped against her coffee mug, the 2 young women forever frozen in a moment of happiness that had preceded their disappearance by an unknown amount of time. "Remember what happened?" the inscription read. But remember what? And why hide the message in such an elaborate way instead of simply mailing it or delivering it directly? Unless Dr. Morrison had believed that direct contact would be dangerous, her phone buzzed with a text from Luke. "Found something else. Can you meet tomorrow morning? The old mining road behind the cemetery?" She texted back her agreement, then returned to her timeline. By the time Emma came home, chattering about her chemistry project and complaining about her lab partner's lack of preparation, Marissa had filled 3 pages with questions that had no answers. "How's Jasper's neck?" Emma asked, crouching too. "Examine the bandage. Healing well. Dr. Whitman said we can remove the stitches next week." Emma straightened up, studying her mother's face with the perceptive gaze that sometimes reminded Marissa uncomfortably of David. "You've been weird since his surgery. Is there something you're not telling me?" Was a fair question. Marissa had always tried to be honest with Emma about the important things, but this situation felt too complex and potentially dangerous to share without more understanding. "There were some complications with the surgery," she said carefully. "Not medical complications. Jasper's fine. But Dr. Whitman found something unexpected, and I'm trying to figure out what it means." "What kind of something?" Marissa hesitated, then decided on a version of the truth that wouldn't alarm her daughter unnecessarily. "Something that might connect to our family history. You know how I've always told you that your grandfather's family wasn't very close? It turns out there might have been relatives here in Cedar Falls that we never knew about." Emma's expression shifted from concern to curiosity. "Really? Like living relatives?" "Not anymore. Okay. But there might be a connection to some people who used to live here." "Okay. I'm just trying to understand what it means for us." "Okay." It was enough to satisfy Emma's immediate questions without burdening her with the darker implications. They spent the rest of the evening in comfortable routine, finishing homework while Marissa worked on a logo design for a local bakery, both of them checking on Jasper periodically to ensure his recovery was progressing normally. The mining road behind the cemetery was little more than 2 tire tracks through the grass, leading up into the foothills where prospectors had once searched for silver and gold. Luke's truck was parked at the trailhead, and he was leaning against the tailgate with a thermos of coffee and what appeared to be an old leather journal. "I spent yesterday evening going through more of my uncle's personal papers," he said, as she approached. "Found this in his bedroom, hidden behind some medical texts. The journal was Dr. Morrison's private record of his investigation into Rebecca's disappearance. Unlike the official police reports, these pages contained theories, suspicions, and connections that painted a much more complex picture of what might have happened. He thought they were murdered, Luke said without preamble. Not missing, not runaways. Murdered. And he had ideas about who might have been responsible. The journal entries were dated, starting 3 days after the girls' disappearance and continuing sporadically for nearly 20 years. Dr. Morrison's handwriting grew increasingly shaky as the years passed, but his determination never wavered. October 15, 2003. Police are focusing on the possibility that the girls left voluntarily. They keep asking about boyfriends, about problems at home, about whether Rebecca might have been pregnant. They don't understand that Rebecca would never leave without telling me. Something happened to her. November 2, 2003. Talked to Frank Hartley. Again today. He mentioned that Sarah had been asking questions about the old Brennan property. Something about family stories her grandmother used to tell. Need to follow up on this. December 20th, 2003. The Brennan angle keeps coming up. 3 different people have mentioned that Sarah was interested in local history, specifically stories about the 1920s. What was she looking for? January 8, 2004. Found out today that the Brennan family had connections to bootlegging during Prohibition. Sarah's grandmother worked for them as a housekeeper. Is there a connection? The entries continued, documenting Dr. Morrison's growing conviction that the girls had discovered something about local history that someone wanted to keep hidden. His investigation had focused increasingly on the Brennan family and their property, a large ranch that had been sold and subdivided in the 1980s. March 15, 2008. 5 years now, and the police have given up. But I know Rebecca is dead, and I know someone in this town killed her. The Brennan connection is real. Thomas Brennan's grandson still lives here. Still owns part of the original property. Need to find a way to investigate without alerting him. June 22, 2010. Robert won't return my calls. Tried reaching out through Helen, but she says he doesn't want contact with me. If something happens to me, no one will know what I've learned. Need to find another way to preserve the information. The later entries revealed Dr. Morrison's growing paranoia and his decision to create the capsule as insurance against his own death. September 12, 2015. Arranged for the implant through Dr. Peterson in Minneapolis. If my suspicions are correct, someone will eventually try to contact Robert's family. When they do, Marissa will be prepared. The truth can't die with me. Dr. Peterson, Marissa asked, looking up from the journal. The veterinarian who put the capsule in Jasper, Luke explained. My uncle sent Jasper to him for routine surgery when you were out of town for work. Told you it was necessary dental work, if I remember the records correctly. Marissa did remember. Jasper had been about 6 months old, and Dr. Peterson had recommended removing some retained puppy teeth. She'd left Jasper at the clinic for what she'd been told was a minor procedure, picking him up that evening with no indication that anything unusual had happened. Your uncle planned this for years, she said, still processing the scope of the deception. He was desperate, Luke said quietly, and he was running out of time. His heart condition was getting worse, and he knew he might not live to see Rebecca's case solved. They walked up the mining road together, following the faint track as it wound through stands of pine and aspen. The autumn air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of wood smoke from distant chimneys. It was beautiful country, the kind of place that should have felt peaceful and safe. Tell me about the Brennan family, Marissa said. Luke was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. Old money by Cedar Falls standards. Thomas Brennan came here in the 1890s and built a cattle empire. His son expanded into other businesses, real estate, mining, some less legitimate enterprises during Prohibition. The family was powerful, connected, not the kind of people you crossed lightly. And the grandson, Marcus Brennan, he's in his 70s now, owns the hardware store and several rental properties in town. Served on the city council for 20 years. Knows everyone. Well respected. You don't sound convinced. Luke stopped walking and turned to face her. My uncle believed Marcus Brennan killed Rebecca and Sarah to protect some family secret. Marcus Brennan is also the man who organized the search parties. who donated money for the reward fund, who spent weeks combing through the mountains looking for them. People can be very good at hiding their true nature. Yes, Luke said grimly. They can. They continued up the trail, the silence broken only by the crunch of leaves under their feet and the distant call of a jay. Finally, they reached a cleared area that offered a view back down toward Cedar Falls. The town spread out in the valley like a child's model train set. There's something else, Luke said, pulling out his phone. I got a call this morning from Mrs. Henderson at the clinic. Someone came by yesterday asking questions about you. Marissa felt her stomach drop. What kind of questions? General things? Apparently, how long you'd been bringing Jasper in, whether you'd had any unusual procedures done, whether you'd seemed upset or worried about anything. Mrs. Henderson said it was a man she'd never seen before, claimed to be an old friend, trying to reconnect. Did she give him any information? No. She's been working for veterinarians long enough to know that client information is confidential. But the fact that someone was asking suggests that word is getting out about what we found. They stood looking down at the town, both lost in their own thoughts. Somewhere down there, someone was watching and waiting. Someone who might know what had happened to Rebecca Morrison and Sarah Hartley 20 years ago. What do we do now? Marissa asked. Luke was quiet for a long moment, then said, I think we need to talk to Marcus Brennan. Brennan's Hardware occupied a corner building on Main Street that had probably been elegant once, but now showed the accumulated wear of decades serving a small mountain community. The wooden floors creaked under decades of boots and work shoes, and the air carried the mingled sense of metal polish, leather goods, and the coffee that Marcus Brennan kept brewing in a pot near the register. Marissa had driven past the store countless times, but never had reason to go inside. Now, as she pushed through the heavy glass door with Luke beside her, she felt the weight of curious eyes following their movement. 2 customers browsed the aisles, an elderly man examining fence posts, and a woman comparing paint samples, but their attention seemed focused on the newcomers rather than their shopping. Marcus Brennan emerged from behind the counter with the easy smile of someone accustomed to greeting neighbors and friends. He was tall and still sturdy at 73, with silver hair and the kind of weathered hands that spoke of a lifetime of practical work. His eyes were pale, blue, and sharp, missing nothing as they assessed his visitors. Dr. Whitman, he said, warmly extending his hand. Good to see you. How are you settling into your uncle's practice? Very well, thank you, Mr. Brennan. I'd like you to meet Marissa Blake. She's been living in Cedar Falls for a few years now. Marcus turned his attention to Marissa, and she felt the full force of his scrutiny. His handshake was firm, his manner courteous, but something in his expression suggested he already knew exactly who she was. Mrs. Blake, he said, I've heard good things about your work. Local businesses speak highly of your design services. It was a perfectly pleasant comment, but it carried an undertone that made Marissa uncomfortable. In a town of 3,200 people, everyone knew something about everyone else. But Marcus Brennan's knowledge felt more specific than casual neighborly awareness. Thank you, she said. Actually, we were hoping to ask you about some local history. Luke mentioned that your family has deep roots here. For generations, Marcus confirmed, his expression remaining pleasantly neutral. My great-grandfather started the ranch in 1892. Is there something specific you're interested in? Luke stepped forward slightly, and Marissa noticed his posture had become more formal, more cautious. We're looking into the Morrison case, Rebecca Morrison and Sarah Hartley. The change in Marcus Brennan was subtle but unmistakable. His smile remained fixed, but his eyes grew harder, more calculating. That's a tragedy that touched everyone in this community, he said carefully. 2 wonderful young women. You asking about it now? Some new information has come to light, Luke said. Information that suggests the case might not be as cold as people assumed. Marcus nodded slowly, but his manner had shifted from neighborly to guarded. I'm not sure what I could tell you that I didn't tell the police 20 years ago. I helped organize the search efforts, donated money for the reward fund. Like everyone else, I hoped they'd be found safe. What can you tell us about the connection between Sarah Hartley and your family's property? Marissa asked. The question hung in the air like smoke. Marcus Brennan's eyes flicked from her to Luke and back again, and for a moment his composure slipped enough to reveal something that might have been anger or fear. "I'm not sure what you mean," he said finally. "We understand that Sarah had been asking questions about your family's history," Luke pressed. "Something about the 1920s, maybe about activities during Prohibition?" Marcus set down the wrench he'd been holding, the metal clanging against the counter with more force than necessary. "Young man, I don't know where you're getting your information, but you're treading on dangerous ground. Some stones are better left unturned." "Is that a threat?" Marissa asked, surprised by her own boldness. Marcus's laugh was dry and humorless. "Mrs. Blake, it's advice. This town has moved on from that tragedy. Dredging up old pain won't bring those girls back, and it won't help their families heal. But it might help them find peace," Luke said quietly. "My uncle never stopped looking for Rebecca. He died believing someone in this town knew what happened to her." "Your uncle was a good man, but grief can make people see conspiracies where none exist," Marcus replied. "Sometimes people disappear because they choose to. Sometimes tragedies happen without villains to blame." The elderly man examining fence posts had moved closer, clearly listening to the conversation. The woman with the paint samples had abandoned her shopping entirely and stood near the door, her attention fixed on the exchange at the counter. "We should probably continue this conversation somewhere more private," Marissa suggested. Marcus shook his head. "I don't think we need to continue it at all. I've told you everything I can tell you, which is exactly what I told the police 20 years ago. 2 young women disappeared, and despite extensive searches and investigations, they were never found. That's the beginning and end of what I know." He moved toward the door, clearly intending to escort them out, but Luke didn't budge. "Mr. Brennan, what was your family's business relationship with Sarah Hartley's grandmother?" The question stopped Marcus cold. His face went pale, and for a moment he looked much older than his 73 years. "I think you should leave," he said quietly. "She worked for your family during Prohibition," Luke continued. "She would have known about the activities on your property. Is that what Sarah was asking about? Get out." The words were spoken softly, but they carried a weight that made both Marissa and Luke take a step backward. They left the hardware store in tense silence, aware that every eye in the place was following their exit. Once they reached the sidewalk, Marissa felt like she could breathe again. "Well," she said, "that went well." Luke was looking back at the store where Marcus Brennan stood in the window watching them. "He knows something. The question is whether he was involved or just trying to protect someone who was." They walked toward Luke's truck, neither speaking, until they were out of earshot of the hardware store. The encounter had confirmed Dr. Morrison's suspicions, but it also made it clear that pursuing the truth would not be without risks. "What do we do now?" Marissa asked as they reached the parking area behind the clinic. "I think we need to find out more about Sarah Hartley's grandmother and what she might have known about the Brennan family," Luke said. "And we need to be careful about who we ask," as if to underscore his point. A dark sedan that had been parked across the street started its engine and pulled away from the curb. Marissa couldn't see the driver through the tinted windows, but she had the distinct feeling they'd been watched during their entire conversation with Marcus Brennan. "Luke," she said, "I think we're in over our heads." Key nodded grimly. "I think you're right. But I also think we're the only ones who care enough to find out what really happened to Rebecca and Sarah." That evening, Marissa sat in her kitchen, with Emma helping her daughter work through a challenging calculus problem while Jasper dozed at their feet. The scene was perfectly ordinary, achingly normal, and it made her acutely aware of how much she had to lose if their investigation went wrong. Emma looked up from her textbook and studied her mother's face. "You're worried about something?" "Just thinking about work stuff," Marissa said, which was both true and completely inadequate. "Mom, you can tell me if something's wrong, right? I'm not a little kid anymore." The temptation to share everything was overwhelming. Emma was intelligent and level-headed, old enough to understand complex situations and strong enough to handle difficult truths. But she was also 17 and planning for college, and Marissa couldn't bear the thought of burdening her with the weight of a 20-year-old mystery that might put them all in danger. "I know," Marissa said, reaching across the table to squeeze her daughter's hand. "And if there's ever anything you need to know, I'll tell you." I promise." It was a promise she hoped she'd never have to break. But as she looked down at Jasper's peaceful form and thought about the photograph hidden in her desk drawer, she wondered if she was being naive to think they could pursue the truth without consequences. Somewhere in Cedar Falls, someone was watching and waiting. Someone who had managed to keep a terrible secret for 20 years. And now that secret was under threat from a veterinarian with too many questions and a woman who'd never known she had a cousin named Rebecca Morrison. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. 3 days after their confrontation with Marcus Brennan, Marissa received a phone call from a woman who identified herself as Mrs. Dorothy Chen, a retired librarian who had worked at the Cedar Falls Public Library for 37 years. "I understand you've been asking questions about the Morrison case," Mrs. Chen said without preamble. "I have something you need to see, but not over the phone. Can you meet me at the library after hours? I still have a key." The library sat on a quiet side street, a brick building from the 1960s that had aged gracefully despite chronic underfunding. Mrs. Chen was waiting in the parking lot when Marissa arrived. A small woman in her 70s with silver hair and the kind of sharp eyes that suggested she'd spent decades helping people find information they didn't know how to look for. "I've been debating whether to call you for 3 days," Mrs. Chen said as she unlocked the front door. "But I keep thinking about those 2 girls and how their families never got answers." The library felt different after hours, hushed and mysterious, in a way that daylight never revealed. Mrs. Chen led Marissa through the main reading room to a smaller space in the back labeled Local History Collection. "I was the one who helped Sarah Hartley with her research," Mrs. Chen said, settling into a chair beside a table covered with manila folders and old newspapers. "She came in several times during the summer of 2003, asking about the Brennan family and their business dealings in the 1920s. She opened one of the folders, revealing photocopied pages from various sources' old newspapers. Court documents, business records that looked like they'd been preserved, despite someone's best efforts to make them disappear. Sarah was writing her senior thesis on local history," Mrs. Chen continued. "But she became obsessed with one particular story her grandmother had told her about working for the Brennan family during Prohibition. The first document was a newspaper clipping from 1924, yellowed and brittle, but still legible. The headline read, 'Federal agents raid Brennan Ranch. Find evidence of bootlegging operation,' according to Sarah's grandmother. The federal raid was just for show," Mrs. Chen explained. "The real operation was much larger than what the agents found, and it involved several prominent families in the area. But someone had tipped off the Brennans, and most of the evidence had been moved before the raid." Marissa studied the newspaper article, which described a modest seizure of illegal alcohol and the arrest of 2 ranch hands, who were later released for lack of evidence. Thomas Brennan, the patriarch, had claimed complete ignorance of any illegal activities on his property. Sarah's grandmother told her there was a cave system on the Brennan property where they stored thousands of gallons of illegal liquor. Mrs. Chen continued. "But more importantly, she said there were records ledgers that showed which local officials were being paid to look the other way, which businesses were involved in distribution, which families were partners in the operation." Next document was a hand-drawn map, photocopied from what appeared to be a notebook. It showed the Brennan property as it had existed in the 1920s, with various outbuildings marked in what looked like cave entrances indicated in the foothills behind the main house. Sarah became convinced that those records still existed somewhere, Mrs. Chen said. She thought if she could find them, she'd have the foundation for an incredible thesis about corruption and organized crime in rural Montana during Prohibition. "Did she find anything?" Mrs. Chen's expression grew troubled. "I don't know. She stopped coming to the library in late August. When I saw her around town after that, she seemed different, excited, but also nervous, like she'd discovered something important, but wasn't sure what to do about it." Marissa felt a chill as the implications became clear. "You think she found the records. I think she found something that scared her. And I think she told the wrong person about it." The next folder contained more recent materials, articles from regional newspapers about the Brennan family's continued prominence in local politics and business. Marcus Brennan had served on the city council, the school board, and the county planning commission. His endorsement was considered essential for any local political candidate, and his opinions carried significant weight in community decisions. The Brennan family has been involved in every major development decision in this county for the past 50 years, Mrs. Chen said. Shopping centers, housing developments, industrial projects, they've had a hand in all of it. And much of that development has been on land that originally belonged to other families. You're suggesting they used their political influence for financial gain? I'm suggesting that people with secrets are vulnerable to those who know the secrets. Mrs. Chen replied carefully, and that ledgers from the 1920s might contain information that could still damage reputations and business relationships today. She pulled out a final documenta photocopy of what appeared to be a page from an old leather-bound book. The handwriting was faded but legible, listing names, dates, and dollar amounts in careful columns. Sarah found this page, Mrs. Chen said quietly. She brought it to me 2 days before she disappeared, asking if I thought it was authentic. Marissa studied the page, her eyes widening as she recognized several names that were still prominent. In Cedar Falls, the heading at the top read August 1924 protection payments, and the list below included the sheriff, 2 county commissioners, the bank president, and several local business owners. This is incredible, Marissa breathed. If Sarah found a complete ledger, she'd have had enough information to destroy several of the most powerful families in the county, Mrs. Chen finished. Families whose children and grandchildren still live here, still control local politics and business. Why didn't you take this to the police 20 years ago? Mrs. Chen's laugh was bitter. It's 'cause the police chief's grandfather is on that list. Because the county sheriff's family has received Brennan political support for 3 generations. Because in a small town, everyone is connected to everyone else, and some connections are more dangerous than others. They sat in silence for a moment, both staring at the damning document. Finally, Marissa spoke. Mrs. Chen, do you have any idea where Sarah might have hidden the rest of the ledger? I've wondered about that for 20 years, the librarian replied. But Sarah was a smart girl. She found something that dangerous, she would have hidden it somewhere safe, somewhere that only she and maybe Rebecca would have known about. Rebecca was with her when she found it. Rebecca was with her everywhere that summer. They were inseparable, and Rebecca was almost as interested in the research as Sarah was. If Sarah found those records, Rebecca knew about it. A terrible possibility was beginning to form in Marissa's mind. Mrs. Chen, what if they weren't killed to silence them? What if they were killed because someone wanted what they'd found? The older woman nodded slowly. That occurred to me as, well, and if that's true, then whoever killed them might still be looking for those records. They gathered up the documents, and Mrs. Chen carefully returned them to their folders. As they prepared to leave, she turned to Marissa with an expression of deep concern. Mrs. Blake, I need you to understand something I've kept quiet about. This for 20 years because I was afraid. I'm still afraid. These people have long memories and significant power. If you continue investigating this case, you need to be very careful about who you trust. As they walked toward the front door, Mrs. Chen added quietly, there's one more thing. The day after Sarah and Rebecca disappeared, someone broke into the library. Nothing was taken, but the local history collection was thoroughly searched. Whoever did it was looking for something specific, looking for what Sarah had found, or looking for any trace of her research. I'd made copies of some documents for her, kept them in a separate file. That file disappeared during the break-in. They stepped out into the cool evening air, and Mrs. Chen locked the door behind them. As Marissa walked to her car, the older woman called after her, Mrs. Blake. If Sarah did hide those records, and if they're still hidden somewhere after all, these years, finding them might be the only way to get justice for those girls. But it might also be the only way to join them. Driving home through the quiet streets of Cedar Falls, Marissa felt the weight of what she'd learned pressing down on her like a physical force. Sarah Hartley and Rebecca Morrison hadn't simply disappeared, they'd been murdered for knowledge that threatened some of the most powerful people in the county. And now, 20 years later, that same knowledge was stirring up old fears and dangerous memories. When she reached home, she found Emma asleep on the couch with her calculus textbook open on her chest and Jasper stretched out on the floor beside her. The scene was so peaceful, so normal, that it made Marissa's heart ache with the desire to protect this simple happiness from the darkness. She was uncovering, but as she gently woke Emma and sent her upstairs to bed, she couldn't shake the feeling that it was already too late for protection. Someone in Cedar Falls had committed murder to protect their secrets 20 years ago, and they wouldn't hesitate to do it again if those secrets were threatened. The photograph from Jasper's neck was no longer just a mysterious message from a grieving father. It was evidence of a crime that had never been solved. It's a crime that powerful people had worked very hard to keep buried. And now, Marissa Blake, a woman who'd come to Cedar Falls seeking peace and anonymity, found herself holding the key to a truth that someone had killed to protect. Asterisk. The anonymous note arrived on a Thursday morning, slipped under Marissa's front door sometime during the night while she and Emma slept. The paper was unremarkable plain white computer stock, but the message it carried made her hands shake. As she read it, stop digging or join them. Below the typed words was something that made her blood run cold. A photocopy of Emma's school ID picture. Marissa sank into her kitchen chair, the note trembling in her fingers. Jasper approached and rested, his head on her knee, somehow sensing her distress. The threat was clear: an immediate continue investigating Rebecca and Sarah's disappearance, and Emma would be in danger. She called Luke immediately, her voice barely steady as she described the note. He was at her house within 15 minutes. His usual calm demeanor replaced by grim determination. "We're calling the police," he said after examining the note. "Are we?" Marissa asked bitterly. "Mrs. Chen told us the police chief's grandfather is on that list of people who took bribes from the Brennans. How do we know we can trust anyone in law enforcement?" Luke was quiet for a moment, studying the note. "Then we call the state police. Or the FBI. This is a threat against a minor, Marissa. It's a federal crime. And while we're waiting for them to investigate, Emma goes to school every day in a town where someone wants to hurt her." Marissa stood up and began pacing. "No, we need to end this ourselves. How we find those records Sarah discovered. We find proof of what happened to her and Rebecca, and we make it public in a way that protects Emma and forces the truth into the open." Luke shook his head. "That's exactly what they don't want us to do. That note is meant to scare you into backing off." "Then they don't know me very well," Marissa said, surprising herself with the steel in her voice. "I've already lost a marriage to someone who thought he could manipulate and control me. I'm not losing my daughter to someone who thinks they can threaten their way out of murder charges." That afternoon, while Emma was at school, Marissa and Luke drove out to the old Brennan property. Much of the original ranch had been sold and subdivided over the years, but Marcus Brennan still owned the original homestead and several hundred acres of the more remote land. They parked at the edge of the property and hiked in, following the hand-drawn map Mrs. Chen had shown them. The terrain was rough, covered with scrub pine and scattered boulders, but the landmarks on the 1920s map were still identifiable. "There," Luke said, pointing to a cluster of rock formations about a quarter-mile ahead. "That matches the drawing of where the cave entrances should be." They found the first cave, Islianufa, natural opening in the hillside that had been enlarged with tools probably during the bootlegging era. Luke had brought flashlights and basic spelunking gear, borrowed from a friend who explored caves as a hobby. The cave system was more extensive than either of them had expected. Multiple chambers connected by narrow passages, some large enough to stand upright, others requiring them to crawl on hands and knees. The air was cold and stale, carrying the musty scent of decades without human presence. In the third chamber they explored, Luke's flashlight beam caught something that made them both freeze. "Jesus," he whispered. Dots scattered across the cave floor were the remnants of wooden crates, their boards rotted and collapsed, but still arranged in rows that suggested organized storage. Between the crate remnants lay hundreds of broken glass bottles, their surfaces clouded with age, but their shapes unmistakably those of liquor bottles from the Prohibition era. "This is it," Marissa breathed. This is where they stored the illegal alcohol. But it was what they found in the deepest chamber that made their discovery truly significant. Against the far wall, protected by an overhang that had kept it relatively dry, sat a metal filing cabinet. The locks had long since rusted away, and the top drawer opened with a grinding protest of metal against metal. Inside were ledgers, dozens of them, their leather covers cracked with age, but their contents still legible. Page after page of meticulous records documenting one of the largest bootlegging operations in Montana's history. "My God," Luke said, carefully lifting one of the ledgers. Sarah was right. It's all here. The records were comprehensive and damning. Not just protection payments to local officials, but detailed accounts of a criminal enterprise that had involved dozens of prominent families and generated enormous profits that had been reinvested in legitimate businesses throughout the region. Marissa photographed page after page with her phone, documenting evidence that could rewrite the history of their entire county. But as she worked, a growing sense of unease made her hands shake. "Luke," she said finally, "if these records have been here all this time, why didn't Sarah take them when she found them?" Luke looked up from the ledger he'd been examining. Maybe she did take some of them. Maybe she was planning to come back for the rest. Or maybe she never got the chance. They worked for another hour, photographing as many pages as possible, before the approaching darkness made it dangerous to remain in the caves. As they prepared to leave, Marissa took one final look around the chamber that had hidden its secrets for so long. That's when she saw it in a corner of the chamber. Partially hidden by fallen rocks was something that didn't belong with the Prohibition-era artifacts. Something newer, something that made her stomach clench with dread. A piece of fabric, pink fabric that looked like it might once have been part of a dress or blouse. "Luke!" she called, her voice barely above a whisper. He followed her gaze to the corner, and his face went pale. Together, they approached the spot, moving rocks carefully, afraid of what they might find. The fabric was attached to something larger, something that had been deliberately hidden beneath the rockfall. As they cleared away more stones, the horrible truth became apparent. They had found Rebecca Morrison and Sarah Hartley. The bodies were skeletal now, 20 years of mountain weather having done their work despite the protection of the cave. There was enough remaining to confirm what they both already knew in their hearts. The pink fabric belonged to a dress that matched one in the photographs Mrs. Chen had shown them of Sarah. Near Rebecca's remains was a small gold locket that Luke recognized from family photos. "They were murdered here," Marissa said, her voice hollow with shock. "Killed and hidden in the same place that held the evidence they discovered." Luke was kneeling beside the remains, his professional training taking over despite the emotional impact. "There's trauma to both skulls," he said quietly. "Blunt force injuries. This wasn't an accident." They documented everything with photographs, though every instinct screamed at them to flee this place of death and secrets. As they prepared to leave, Marissa noticed something else, a small notebook tucked beneath Rebecca's remains. It's protected from the elements by its position. The notebook was water-damaged, but still readable. It was Rebecca's handwriting, documenting her and Sarah's discovery of the ledgers and their growing realization of the danger they were. In August 15th, 2003, found the cave today. Sarah was right. The records are all here, just like her grandmother said. We can prove everything. August 20th, 2003. Someone followed us to the library today. Sarah thinks we should tell someone, but who can we trust? Half the families in town are mentioned in these ledgers. September 18th, 2003, Marcus Brennan called Sarah's house. Said he wanted to talk to her about her research. Sarah's scared, but thinks maybe he wants to help. I told her it's a trap, but she won't listen. September 19th, 2003. Meeting Marcus at the cave tomorrow. Sarah thinks he might have more information. I have a bad feeling about this, but I can't let her go alone. The final entry was dated September 20th, 2003, the day they disappeared, as they hiked back to Luke's truck. Both carrying the weight of what they discovered, Marissa's phone buzzed. With a text message, it was from Emma. "Mom, there's a man at the house asking about you. He says he's from your work, but he won't give me his name. I'm scared." Marissa's blood turned to ice. They have Emma. Luke was already running toward the truck. "Call 911. I told you, we can't trust local law enforcement." "Then call the state. Police? Call the FBI. Call everyone." He started the engine and gunned it toward the main road. But first, we're going to get your daughter." As they raced through the gathering darkness towards Cedar Falls, Marissa realized that the anonymous note had been more than a threat, had been a warning. Someone had known they were getting close to the truth, and now they were willing to escalate from threats to action. The evidence they'd found in the cave could bring justice for Rebecca and Sarah, could expose decades of corruption and murder. But first, they had to save Emma, and they had to do it before whoever had killed two young women 20 years ago decided that Emma Blake knew too much to live. They reached Marissa's house to find the front door standing open and no sign of Emma or the mysterious visitor. Marissa's heart hammered against her ribs as she called her daughter's name, moving from room to room while Luke checked the backyard and garage. "Her car's still here," Luke called from the driveway, "and her backpack is on the kitchen counter." Marissa's phone rang, the sound sharp and urgent in the silence. The caller ID showed only a number she didn't recognize. "Mrs. Blake." The voice was male, older, with the careful diction of someone accustomed to giving orders. "I believe you're looking for your daughter. Where is she?" Marissa's voice came out steadier than she felt. "She's safe, for now. But that could change very quickly, depending on your next choices. What do you want?" "I want you to stop digging into matters that don't concern you. I want you to forget what you found today in that cave. And I want you to leave Cedar Falls and never come back." Marissa closed her eyes, fighting the urge to agree immediately. Emma's safety was paramount, but giving in to threats would only guarantee that they'd never be safe anywhere. "How do I know she's okay?" There was a pause. Then Emma's voice came on the line, shaky but defiant. "Mom, I'm okay. Don't give them what they want." "These people are..." The line went quiet. Then the man's voice returned. "As you can hear, she's unharmed. Ups. But she's also spirited, which could become a problem if you don't cooperate." "I'll cooperate," Marissa said quickly. "Just tell me what you want me to do." "Bring the photographs you took in the cave to the old grain elevator on Route 7. Come alone. You have 1 hour." The line went dead. Luke had been listening to the conversation, his face grim with understanding. "It's a trap. Of course it's a trap. But they have Emma. We call for backup. State police, FBI, someone." Marissa was already moving toward her computer, uploading the photographs from her phone to a cloud storage account. "There's no time. And even if we could trust law enforcement, how long would it take them to respond? Emma could be dead by then." She finished the upload and grabbed a USB drive from her desk drawer, copying the most damning photographs to the portable storage device. "I'm going to the grain elevator. But first, I'm making sure this evidence is preserved no matter what happens to me." Luke caught her arm as she headed for the door. "Marissa, these people have already killed twice. They won't hesitate to kill again. Then we make sure they don't get the chance." She pulled out her phone and sent a delayed email. 3 different news organizations with copies of the photographs and a brief explanation of what they'd discovered. The email was set to send automatically in 2 hours unless she canceled it. "If I don't come back, the story goes public anyway." They drove separately toward the grain elevator, Luke following at a distance with instructions to call for help. If things went wrong, the grain elevator was a relic from Cedar Falls' agricultural past. A tall concrete structure that had been abandoned for over a decade when the grain company moved their operations to a more modern facility. Marissa arrived, first parking her car in front of the main building as instructed. The area was deserted, the nearest occupied building over a mile away. It was an ideal location for a confrontation that no one was meant to witness. A black SUV sat in the shadows behind the elevator, and as Marissa approached the main entrance, 3 figures emerged from the building. Marcus Brennan was one of them, looking older and more haggard than he had in his hardware store just days earlier. The other 2 were younger men she didn't recognize, both carrying the kind of alert posture that suggested military or law enforcement. "Backgrounds." "Mrs. Blake," Marcus said, his voice carrying none of the neighborly warmth she remembered. "Do you have what we asked for?" Marissa held up the USB drive. "Where's my daughter?" "Safe for now." Marcus gestured to one of his companions, who spoke into a radio. After a moment, Emma appeared in the doorway of the grain elevator, flanked by another man who kept one hand on her shoulder. Even from a distance, Marissa could see that Emma was frightened. but unharmed. The sight of her daughter filled her with a mixture of relief and rage that made her hands shake. "Let her go," Marissa said. "I'll give you the drive. You'll give me the drive and you'll delete every copy you've made. Kay, and you'll forget everything you learned today," Marcus corrected. "And then maybe your daughter gets to go home. Kay maybe isn't good enough." Marcus's expression hardened. "You're hardly in a position to negotiate. Mrs. Blake, you've seen what happened to the last two young women who threatened my family's interests. You killed them. I protected my family's legacy from people who wanted to destroy it for their own selfish purposes." Marcus stepped closer, his pale eyes cold and determined. "Those girls found records that could have ruined dozens of families, destroyed businesses that employed half this county, brought down political careers that had benefited this community for decades. They were going to publish their findings, out of naive idealism, without any consideration for the consequences. The consequences of exposing criminals. The consequences of destroying a community." Marcus's voice rose slightly, passion breaking through his controlled demeanor. "You don't understand what life was like here during the Depression. What my grandfather had to do to keep this town alive. Yes, there was bootlegging. Yes, there were bribes and deals that wouldn't look good in today's newspapers. But that money built schools and hospitals and businesses that employed generations of families. And that justified murder. That justified protecting what we built." Marcus glanced toward Emma, his meaning clear. "Just as I'm protecting it now." Marissa looked at her daughter, standing 50 yards away with a stranger's hand on her shoulder, and felt something crystallize inside her. Fear transformed into cold determination, the same resolve that had gotten her through the divorce, through the move to Cedar Falls, through all the challenges of raising Emma alone. "You're right about one thing," she said quietly. "I'm not in a position to negotiate." She held up the USB drive, then threw it as hard as she could toward the grain elevator. It clattered across the concrete and disappeared into the shadows. "Neither are you." The moment the USB drive left her hand, chaos erupted. Marcus shouted orders to his men, one of whom immediately started toward the grain elevator to retrieve the device. The man guarding Emma tightened his grip on her shoulder, but Emma had inherited her mother's stubborn streak and her father's quick thinking. She stomped hard on her captor's foot and broke free, running toward the maze of equipment and concrete barriers that surrounded the grain elevator. Her sudden movement caught everyone off guard, creating the distraction Marissa had been hoping for. Luke's truck came roaring around the corner of the building, and Marissa heard the distant wail of sirens approaching from town. Luke had ignored her instructions to wait and called for backup anyway. "Find that drive." Marcus screamed at his remaining companion, who was already moving toward the shadows where the device had disappeared. Marissa ran toward the grain elevator, calling Emma's name and dodging between concrete pillars and rusted machinery. Behind her, she could hear Marcus and his men shouting orders and giving chase. She found Emma crouched behind a pile of old conveyor equipment, her face pale but her eyes blazing with determination. "Mom, are you okay?" "I'm fine. We need to get out of here." Marissa grabbed Emma's hand and pulled her toward what she hoped was an exit on the far side of the building. They emerged into the open just as the first police car came screaming into the lot, followed by Luke's truck and two more patrol vehicles. Marcus Brennan stood in the middle of the chaos, his carefully controlled facade finally cracking as he realized his world was collapsing around him. "It's over, Marcus," Luke called out as he jumped from his truck. "We found the bodies. We found the ledgers. We have enough evidence to bury you and everyone who helped you." Marcus looked around at the approaching officers, at Marissa and Emma holding each other, at the grain elevator where his hired men were still searching for a USB drive. That would make no difference to the outcome. His shoulders sagged as decades of buried guilt and fear finally caught up with him. "You don't understand," he said, his voice carrying across the lot. "They were going to destroy everything. Generations of work, of building this community, of providing for families. All for what? So they could write a college paper about something that happened 80 years ago?" Sheriff Janet Morrison, no relation to Dr. Morrison, despite the shared name, approached with her weapon drawn but pointed safely downward. "Marcus Brennan, You're under arrest for kidnapping, conspiracy, and suspicion of murder. Yes. The handcuffs clicked around Marcus's wrists. He looked directly at Marissa. You have no idea what you've done? How many people you've hurt? I've brought justice for 2 young women who deserved better, Marissa replied. And I've made sure my daughter will grow up in a world where people can't commit murder and expect to get away with it just because they have money and influence. The next few hours passed in a blur of statements and questions. The state police and FBI agents who arrived to take over the investigation were thorough but respectful. Understanding that Marissa and Emma had been through a traumatic experience, Luke provided detailed testimony about the cave discovery, and Mrs. Chen emerged from 20 years of frightened silence to share everything she knew about Sarah's research. The USB drive was eventually recovered from where it had landed near the grain elevator, but by then it hardly mattered. Luke had already uploaded backup copies of all the photographs to secure servers. As dawn broke over Cedar Falls, Marissa sat in the lobby of the sheriff's station with Emma curled up beside her, both of them exhausted but safe. Luke approached with 2 cups of coffee and the latest update from the investigators. They're calling it one of the largest cold case breaks in Montana history, he said, settling into a chair across from them. The FBI is already talking about expanding the investigation to look at other unsolved cases that might be connected. What happens to Marcus? Emma asked, her voice hoarse from the night's ordeal. He's going to prison for a very long time, Luke replied. And his hired men are already talking, trying to cut deals by providing information about other crimes. Marissa sipped her coffee and watched the sun rise through the station's windows. After 3 years of seeking anonymity in Cedar Falls, she'd inadvertently become the center of the biggest news story in the town's history. But for the first time since her divorce, she felt like she'd accomplished something truly meaningful. Mom? Emma said quietly, yes, I'm proud of you. For not giving up even when they threatened me. For doing the right thing. Marissa squeezed her daughter's hand, feeling tears she'd been holding back all night finally start to fall. I'm proud of you too. For being brave, for fighting back when you had the chance. They sat together in comfortable silence. 3 people who'd been brought together by tragedy but had found strength in each other. Outside, Cedar Falls was waking up to a new reality, one where old secrets could no longer stay buried in justice. However delayed, would finally be served. 6 months later, Marissa stood in the cemetery outside Cedar Falls, watching as 2 new headstones were unveiled in a quiet ceremony attended by dozens of community members. The stones were simple granite markers that bore the names Rebecca, Morrison, and Sarah Hartley, along with dates that bracketed lives cut tragically short. Dr. Morrison's grave was nearby, and someone had left fresh flowers. There, Luke, probably, who made a point of visiting his uncle's resting place every few weeks. The old veterinarian had never lived to see his daughter's case solved. That his desperate gambit with the surgical capsule had ultimately brought the truth to light. Emma stood beside her mother, holding a small bouquet of wildflowers they'd picked that morning during their walk with Jasper. At almost 18 now, Emma had grown more mature over the past months, shaped by experiences that most teenagers never face. She'd handled the media attention with grace, the trial testimony with courage, and the family revelations with the resilience that seemed to be a Morrison trait. Luke approached from the direction of the parking area, looking more relaxed than Marissa had seen him since that first day when they discovered the photograph. The stress of the investigation and trial had taken its toll on everyone involved. But the resolution had brought a kind of peace to the community that hadn't existed for 20 years. How are you holding up? He asked, joining them beside the new grave markers. Better, Marissa said, and meant it. It feels right, finally having them properly buried. The past 6 months had transformed Cedar Falls in ways both large and small. Marcus Brennan was serving a life sentence without possibility of parole, and 3 of his accomplices had received significant prison terms. The corruption investigation had expanded to encompass decades of questionable business deals and political decisions, leading to resignations and reforms that would change local government for generations. But it was the personal transformations that mattered most to Marissa. She'd discovered family she'd never known existed, found strength she hadn't known she possessed, and built relationships that anchored her to this community in ways she'd never expected. "Any word on the college applications?" Luke asked Emma. Emma's face lit up with a kind of excitement that reminded Marissa of the girl she'd been before the complications of the past year. "I got into Montana State, full scholarship, based partly on the essay I wrote about family legacy and standing up for truth. It was a bittersweet victory." Emma would be leaving for college in the fall, starting a new chapter of her life far from the small town that had shaped her final year of high school. But she'd chosen to stay in Montana, close enough for regular visits and far enough away to build her own identity. "I'm proud of you," Luke said simply, and Emma beamed at the approval. They walked together back toward the parking area, past graves that told the history of Cedar Falls in names and dates carved in stone. Near the entrance, they paused at a newer section where a small memorial garden had been planted in honor of Rebecca and Sarah. "I still can't believe it's over," Marissa said, watching a butterfly land on one of the memorial roses. "It's not over," Luke corrected gently. "It's just beginning." For the first time in 20 years, this town can move forward without carrying the weight of unsolved tragedy. He was right, Marissa realized. The resolution of the case had lifted a burden that had pressed down on Cedar Falls like a physical weight. People walked differently now, spoke more freely, seemed more willing to trust and engage with their neighbors. As for herself, Marissa had found something she hadn't expected when she moved to Cedar Falls 3 years earlier. She'd found home. Not just a place to live, but a community where she belonged, where her work mattered, where her family's history was part of a larger story that stretched back generations. Her graphic design business had expanded significantly, partly due to the publicity from the case, but mostly because she'd finally found the confidence to market her skills aggressively. Emma's college fund was secure, their financial future stable. And Marissa was considering buying the house they'd been renting. "What's next for you?" she asked Luke as they reached their cars. He smiled, an expression that reached his eyes in, a way that reminded her of their first meeting at the veterinary clinic. "I'm thinking about expanding the practice. Maybe adding a partner, specializing in large animal care for the ranches in the area." "Sounds like you're planning to stay." "Sounds like I am. What about you?" Marissa looked back toward the memorial garden, where Emma was kneeling to adjust one of the flower arrangements. Jasper stood beside her daughter, his golden coat gleaming. In the afternoon sun, the scar on his neck barely visible beneath his thick fur. "I'm staying too," she said. "Is this home now?" Stood in comfortable silence for a moment. 3 people whose lives had been irrevocably changed by the discovery of a small metal capsule in a dog's neck. The truth had cost them all something: innocence, perhaps, or the simple comfort of believing that justice always prevails. But it had given them something more valuable in return: the knowledge that courage and persistence could overcome even the deepest corruption, that family bonds could transcend death and time, and that sometimes the most profound healing comes from helping others find peace. As they drove back toward town, Marissa caught sight of Jasper in her rearview mirror, his head hanging out the window, ears flapping in the wind, looking every bit like the happy, healthy dog he'd always been. The mysterious lump that had started this entire journey was just a memory now, but the connections it had revealed to family, to community, to purpose would last forever. Cedar Falls spread out before them in the valley, a small town that had kept its secrets for too long but was finally ready to face its future with honesty and hope. And Marissa Blake, who had come here seeking refuge from her own broken dreams, had found something far more valuable: the strength to build new dreams on a foundation of truth and justice. The golden retriever who had carried a 20-year-old message in his neck had delivered it to exactly the right person at exactly the right time. Sometimes, Marissa reflected, the most important mysteries solve themselves when the world is finally ready for the truth.